I have expanded the subtitle to reflect the approach to Fichte that I take. So it's Plato, Kant, and Fichte on the teamwork of the mind. And I begin with a quotation from Freud, attributed to Freud, but no one has been able to find it in Freud. It's constantly, though, used under Freud's name, pseudo-Freud. Everywhere I go, I find a poet has been there before me. My talk places Fichte's sustained recourse to the concept of drive into the historical and systematic context of Platonic and Kantian thinking about the psychopolitics of self-rule. Section 1 prepares Kant's and Fichte's thinking about the unity and functionality of the mind in matters of desire and volition by turning to Plato's poetic comparison of the soul's setup and manner of operation to a team of horses of opposed character that are driven by a seriously challenged charioteer. Section 2 first addresses Kant's account of the twofold, irrational and rational modes of the practical mind, faculty of desire, and the related conception of the will's twofold freedom as arbitrary election and legislative autonomy, and then traces Fichte's appropriation of the concept of drive for detailing the dynamic structure and functionality of the mind's multiple and competing drives, including the natural drive, the pure drive, and the mixed or ethical drive. In drawing on Plato's equine analogy for the mind's regimen of self-rule, the talk builds on the etymological identity of the German term Trieb and its English equivalent drive. To be sure, the German Trieb does not share the extended semantic field of the English drive, which includes the vehicular handling of animals, as in driving a team of horses. Moreover, in resorting to the Platonic modeling of the mind, the talk pays close attention to the civico-political origin and horizon of much of the ethical or generally practical conceptuality employed by Fichte and his prime precursor, Kant, for capturing the complex and conflicted unity and operationality of the mind. Section 1 then, Ancient Hippodramatics. Quotation from Plato, Phaedrus. To begin with, our driver is in charge of a pair of horses. Second, one of his horses is beautiful and good and from stock of the same sort, while the other is the opposite and has the opposite sort of bloodline. This means that chariot driving, in our case, is inevitably a painfully difficult business. End of quote. When reflecting on the diverse modes of rendering concepts sensible, Kant, in section 59 of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, which is charged with elucidating beauty as a symbol of morality, remarks that language is, quote, full of indirect presentations according to an analogy by means of which the expression does not contain the schema proper for the concept, but merely a symbol for reflection. End of quote. The logical relation of analogy between two terms of signification, only one of which refers to a sensible object, while the other denotes an object of thought, introduces the linguistic devices of metaphor and trope as key conveyances for the thinking of that which cannot be sensorially given, but which may prove to be an indispensable part of our intellectual and moral economy. According to Kant, our discourse, including philosophical discourse, is laden with such metaphorical, analogical, or symbolic devices, which, each individually, may be subject to substitution and change, but which, generically and collectively considered, are the indispensable tools of talk and thought. A prime area for the Kantian symbolism of philosophical discourse is moral philosophy broadly conceived, encompassing ethics, juridics, politics, and economics, and juxtaposed to natural philosophy, equally broadly conceived. Kant himself gives the example of a hand mill, analogically, symbolically, or tropically rendering the modern absolutist state, only to immediately juxtapose to it the entirely alternately constituted quasi-republican state ruled by what he calls intrinsically popular laws, likened to a living body or organism, a concept at the very heart of the third critique, second part, on the teleological power of judgment, to which the section in question here, 59, on symbolism, almost forms the transition. The Kantian device of symbolic representation in general, and of philosophical symbolism in particular, has a distinguished history. A paradigmatic instance of the latter is Plato's extended analogy between the soul and the city in the Republic. To be sure, in this case, the symbolizing and the symbolized terms are not distinguished by being sensible and intelligible, respectively. Rather, both domains, the psychological and the politological, are intellectual. But this is also the case with Kant's contrasting of the despotically and the republicanly ruled monarchical state, and with many other cases of philosophical metaphors that draw on a field of symbols already itself heavily informed by nonsensible terms and concepts. The extended psychopolitical analogy that is Plato's Republic has informed much subsequent thinking about the norms and forms of life in the city and the state. Particularly influential has been Plato's image of the quasi-political setup of the soul on the basis of the three estates that make up Socrates' ideal city-state. The focal point of the analogy has been the unity of the psyche and the unity of the polis, respectively, amidst their analogous differentiations into psychic and political powers, forces, or capacities. In particular, there has been pervasive talk about the parts of the soul in analogy to the city-state's political partition. Yet Plato himself is rather reticent about using overtly Mariological language, instead preferring to talk about different kinds or different species of the soul, eide. The simplistic talk about the soul having parts, to be found in a good many readings and interpretations of the Republic, is all the more troubling given Plato's, or rather Socrates' rejection of the soul's composite nature in the Phaedo, where the soul's immortality is at issue. As Plato has Socrates argue in this dialogue, considered roughly contemporaneous with the Republic, what is composed of parts is subject to decomposition into its parts and thus in danger of losing its very unity and hence identity. The crucial moment for the soul's threatening disintegration being the death and ensuing decomposition of the human body. A further feature that caused puzzlement to readers of Plato in past and present is the identification of the parts, the species or the functions that make up the soul as well as the city in the Republic. For here, Plato famously inserts between the brainy and the appetitive regions of the body physical as well as the body politic, the logistikon and the epithymietikon, as he calls it, the irascible modality within the soul and the city, often translated as spiritedness, thymoides. Moreover, in its middle position, halfway in between the head and the underbelly, chesti thymos is open to influence from either of its anatomical neighbors, lending impetus or drive to either the logical or the illogical regions, directions, or orientations of the soul, as well as the city-state. To be sure, for Plato's Socrates, the ambiguous position of thymos is to be disambiguated in favor of the rule of the rational over the irrational by means of the thymotic energy element that is to serve as auxiliary force for assuring the regimen of reason. Barring this right and just order of things, psychic and political, the unity of the soul and the unity of the city are threatened with violent dissolution under the guise of civic strife, not to say civil war, stasis, and its psychic equivalent. The exegetical minutiae involving parts and species notwithstanding, the Republic offers a strategically limited outlook on the relation between the three main elements of the soul and city alike. Normatively considered, the logical or rational part is to rule, the appetitive is to be ruled, and the thymotic middle is to assure reason's rule over the appetites. Given that in the Republic the politics of the soul closely follows city politics, Plato's psychology and its embedded ethics also imitates the political outlook of the work, which must seem distinctly illiberal when compared and contrasted to modern conceptions of the state from Hobbes and Locke through Montesquieu and Rousseau to Kant and Humboldt, to name only the proto and pre-liberals among them. One need not be an adherent of the view championed by Karl Popper in the wake of 20th century totalitarianism on the extreme left as well as right, that Plato must be counted among the enemies of the open society, to perceive the anachronism of Plato in the modern political world, the world of popular sovereignty, liberal democracy, and free market economy, at least in the Western or Western-style parts of the world today. To be sure, there also have been attempts to retrieve, salvage, or restore the standing of Plato's Republic, such as Kant's attempt to redefine the Platonic Republic through the idea of civically compatible individual freedom in the state qua commonwealth, or Hegel's attempt, later mimicked by Nietzsche, to read the Republic as an ideal-type depiction of Greek political ethicality, Sittlichkeit, resuscitated by Plato at the very moment of its device, brought about by the joint forces of Athenian democracy, pseudo-philosophical sophistics, and post-Sophoclean Euripidean experimental theatre. But it is not only the ancient political and ethical values that seem to sit uneasily in the context of modern political and ethical life, together with its philosophical reflection in largely liberal political philosophy from John Stuart Mill to Rawls and from Benjamin Constant to Habermas. The very conceptuality employed by Plato some 24 centuries ago can seem alien to us moderns, with key features that have since become marginal, such as thymos, or inversely concepts that are conspicuously marginal in Plato, but that have enjoyed an almost inflationary circulation in modern times, such as freedom or liberty. In order to grasp the ground for possibly bridging what Lessing called the nasty white ditch, separating the ancients and the moderns, but also separating the ancients among the moderns, the conservatives, from the modern moderns, the liberals, it might help to turn to another of Plato's dialogues for a differently designed image of the soul's setup and function, one less politically fraught and more attuned to the dramatic outlook on psychic life cultivated by the moderns, as exemplified in the theatre from Shakespeare to Ibsen, and in modern philosophical psychology from Spinoza to Freud. This alternative source for the psychodrama underlying ethics and politics is Plato's Phaedrus, another dialogue to be dated in the vicinity of the Republic and ostensibly concerned with matters of love, but also engaging in a mythically clad critique of writing as too rigid and generally mind-deadening a cultural technique. Philosophically, a main preoccupation of the Phaedrus is with the proper place of madness, mania, in a human life, chiefly shaped by reason and self-discipline. The madness to be admitted, even required under those conditions, is divine madness, theia, mania. In that vein, the Phaedrus portrays the proper proportion between the various factors and features that make up the soul in its optimal operation by means of a narratively detailed image inspired by classical mythology and informed by an esteemed contemporary spectator sport. The myth involves a winged charioteer driving a chariot drawn by two winged horses, one of which is described as noble in appearance and character and of light color, the other is base and dark colored. The former horse pulls the chariot upward, while the latter drags it downward on a course suspended between the earth and the sky. It is the task of the driver, charioteer, to handle the horses, keep them on course, and coordinate the often opposite pull exercised by the horses in the team. The imagery of the soul's chariot, employed by Plato's Socrates, draws on a Greek myth, mainly preserved in the much later literary rendition of Ovid's Metamorphoses, about the chariot of the sun, and the celestial phaeton traffic accident, which occurred when the chariot once was driven not by the sun god Helios himself, but by Helios' mortal son, Phaeton. Phaeton, who lacked training and experience, was unable to keep the chariot on course. When the sun chariot came too close to the earth and began to scorch it, Helios had to kill Phaeton with a lightning bolt in order to save the earth. There is no precedent in the Phaeton myth, though, for the joining of oppositely natured horses in one team in Plato's myth. But there is another myth involving a second and even a third mythological figure, also named Phaeton. The term in Greek literally means the shining one. In one instance, Phaeton is the son of the goddess of dawn, Eos, the rose-fingered one in Homer's topical phrase. And in the second instance, Phaeton is the name of one of the two horses of Eos and her chariot, the other horse of the team being called Lampos, meaning glitter. So shine and glitter. In an odd doubling of myths, Eos' chariot ascends the sky every morning before the sunrise, which then in turn is performed by Helios in his own chariot. Compared to Helios' chariot now, the one driven by Eos is more fitting as the background of the Platonic myth. For Eos' chariot is drawn by two horses, as opposed to the four horses pulled by the sun god's chariot. Moreover, pictorial renditions tend to portray Eos in her two-horse chariot with wings on all three figures. Munich's State Antiquities collection on the Königsplatz, right around the corner from here, has a fine specimen of the motif. I think that's the clarity we have, huh? But you can see it? Yeah. It's a cartel from southern Italy from the late 5th century BC. The other context that informs Plato's design of the soul's chariot is the actual deployment of the chariot in late Bronze Age Greek culture, especially in warfare, but more for transport to the battlefield than for actual vehicular fighting. Later, in the Greek military confrontation with Asia, first in the Persian Wars and then in Alexander's Asian campaigns, the Hellenic hoplites, heavily armed foot soldiers with long lances acting in formation, phalanx, proved superior to the enemy's formation of war chariots. By that time, though, the chariot had become a piece of sports equipment, featured at Olympic and other Pan-Hellenic games. But the aristocratic and bellicose pedigree of the chariot survived in chariot racing, it being the most expensive sports discipline to engage in. Typically, the chariot was not even driven by the owner of the chariot and its team of horses, but by a hired athlete. The prize, if any, still went to the team's owner, as in today's world of equine contests. The relevance and revelatory potential of the Greek cultural background in chariot driving for Plato's neo-mythical chariot of the soul becomes strikingly evident in another antiquity from the 5th century BC, Greece. This one not preserved in our Athens on the Isar, but where it belongs, given its original function as a dedicatory statue in Delphi. It is the chariot of Delphi, one of the few ancient Greek bronzes still originally preserved, rather than known through later Roman, mostly marble, copies. The statue is life-size, if not slightly larger, 1.8 meters, portraying the youthful charioteer as he presents himself on the chariot with the two horses, now lost, to the spectators of the race he just won. For present purposes, what matters about the Delphic charioteer is the figure's restraint in the very moment of victory or glory, a posture of self-restraint and self-control, aided, in fact conveyed, by the objectivist style of the statue, which dates from 480 BC, the year of the beginning of the Second Persian invasion, and thus belongs to the brief transitional period between late archaic and early classical style. A strikingly suspended style, also represented by the preserved pediment sculptures from the east side of the Aphaia temple on the island of Aegina, opposite Athens, together with the remaining, more clearly archaic sculptures from the west pediment of that same temple. These remains, the Aeginetic marbles, so to speak, are housed again nearby in Munich's other antiquities collection, the Glyptothek, although currently not on public view due to renovation of the building. The image of control, foremost including self-control, that is conveyed by classical sculpture in general and by the examples from Delphi and Aegina in particular, is apt to visualize the demeanor of the charioteer in Plato's mythical tale, who, while controlling both of his horses, also and most importantly controls himself. The myth, as fabricated by Plato for philosophical purposes, is not about letting the good horse run its course while reining in the bad one. Neither is the myth about choosing between horses and making either the right or the wrong choice among the winning horse, so to speak. Rather, it is about exercising control and remaining in control over the entire chariot setup and knowing where to go in the first place. The myth thus is about the precarious position of the charioteer, who finds himself, as it were, halfway between the earth and the skies, between the world of sense and the world of spirit, and who needs all the control and self-control he is able to muster. But the myth is also, in line with the erotic subtext of the entire dialogue, about self-abandonment in madness, not in madness of all sorts, but in madness of the right sort, divine madness, and about the control of oneself to be retained even and especially in such madness according to method. The congruence in character between Plato's myth of the charioteer and early 5th century BC Greek sculpture is no accident. The discrepancy in chronology between Plato's early 4th century writing and artwork from an entire century earlier reflects the pointed anachronism of Plato's philosophy and politics. Not for Plato, the liberal individualism of Periclean Athens, as perceptively portrayed in Thucydides' account of the early phase of the Peloponnesian War. With his aristocratic leanings, his laconophilia, love of things Spartan, and his grudge, not to say resentment, against mass democratic Athens for the trial and execution of his teacher Socrates, Plato must have seemed a conservative revolutionary in post-war Athens, or shall we say in Attic Weimar. Still, Plato's nostalgia for earlier values and views, for what Hegel came to call Greek ethical life, griechische Sittlichkeit, brings out a politico-philosophical alternative to Athenian proto-liberalism, and a kind of freedom that is unlike the liberty of free choice. A proto-liberal form of freedom cherished by political and moral philosophers from Plato and Aristotle to Kant and Fichte. To Plato and his contemporaries, politicians, philosophers, and citizens alike, freedom or liberty, the Greek for both of them being eleuteria, could mean many things. The base meaning derived from the free master's absolute dominion over the unfree slave, despotes and doulos. Politically speaking, to be free was to rule rather than to be ruled, as in the fragile freedom of the Greeks from Persian rule. When applied to an individual Greek polis, freedom also meant the freedom from a despotic rule by a local strongman, tyrant. Transposed from the political sphere to that of the individual human being, freedom qua self-rule came to mean ruling over one's passions, appetites, and desires, rather than being ruled by them. In analogy to the twofold political freedom from foreign rulers and from domestic tyrants, the pseudo-ethical freedom of self-rule was not only the psycho-ethical freedom of self-rule was not only opposed to the unfreedom of being ruled by someone else, but also to the pseudo-freedom of being ruled by one's own passions, appetites, and desires, in an illusionary scenario of secretly being ruled while seemingly ruling oneself. Such is the case of the tyrannical human being in the psychopolitical pathology provided by Plato's Republic. Section 2 modern psychopolitics. Quote again, this one from Lichtenberg. He used to call his upper and lower forces of the soul the upper and lower house, and very often the former passed a bill that the latter rejected. The political background of the ancient Greek linkage of freedom to self-control finds a modified continuation in modern conceptions of freedom that are political in origin and psychological in application. With the advent of the modern sovereign territorial state in post-feudal Europe, as theorized by Jean Baudin and Thomas Hobbes, political rule, regardless of its outwardly monarchical, aristocratic, or even democratic form, becomes tied to the care for a body politic constituted by sovereign and subjects alike. Commonwealth in Hobbes, République in Baudin. The newly envisioned and provided freedom of the citizen, civic freedom as Montesquieu will call it, consists in entitlements, liberties as we say, to all things not specifically prohibited by the law, the famous silence of the law in Hobbes, eventually formalized in the conception of preterpositive legal claims, natural rights in Locke. In a related development, in some countries, the citizenry collectively considered acquires freedom in a specifically political, as opposed to merely civil sense, political freedom as it's also then called in Montesquieu, by forming part of the legislation of the land. Foremost in England, freedom thus assumes the twofold meaning of being negatively free or at liberty to do as one pleases, and positively free in giving oneself laws through representatives of one's choosing, or at least of one's constituency. Historically speaking, parliamentary representation, however limited and venial, provides a modern successor of sorts to direct democratic self-rule in ancient Greece and to pseudo-democratic client politics in Republican Rome, one deemed superior in principle and fact over the ancient systems. To be sure, the modern system of parliamentary representation, as advanced in England and practiced in continental republican regimes, for example in the Netherlands, the States General at the time, typically is limited to the legislative branch of government and leaves the executive in the hands of a hereditary monarch or a self-selected aristocratic body. Technically speaking, the newly acquired, or at least desired freedom, is not self-rule, but self-legislation, autonomy in the original legislative sense of the term. Only the political upheavals, first called revolutions, at the end of the 18th century, first in British colonial North America, then in bankrupt absolutist France, bring, with varying success and duration, popular sovereignty and democratic government to an extended territory far exceeding the narrow confines of an ancient Greek city-state. The psychological fallout of modern politics and modern political philosophy is foremost visible in Kant, who built his entire mature moral philosophy on the principle of autonomy. To be sure, the ethical law-giving propagated by Kant is not some psychic parliament's majoritarian decision procedure, or norms of conduct to be adopted and followed by all, rather than involving election and selection. The legislation procedure embraced by Kant involves reason, providing the moral law, and the moral agent giving the law unto himself or herself. Ethical autonomy in Kant is not a case of personal self-determination, as in current conceptions of individual, social, civic, or political autonomy. Instead, the nomos in autonomy is reason's own law, and the autos in autonomy is reason itself, with both issues and determines the law. The dual, formal as well as contextual autonomy of reason in Kant's ethics brings with it the extraordinary character of the moral law in Kant. Far from involving a material supreme end, as in ancient eudaemonist ethics under the teleology of some highest good, the basic law of Kantian morality is nothing but the very form of lawfulness, Gesetzmäßigkeit, as such. For Kant, ethical action, or rather the volition that is to underlie it, consists in willing under the law's minimal, merely formal condition of universality, Allgemeinheit. And this for no other reason than that willing under any different form would involve heteronymous factors, inclinations, obstructing the pure rationality of willing and impeding the strict autonomy of reason. Kant freely concedes that ordinary willing occurs under essentially heteronymous conditions, involving self-interest as well as self-deception about that self-interest's involvement. Yet when it comes to the moral character, the morality of willing, all heteronymous factors are to be disregarded, and the universal form of willing is all that matters. In his late quasi-material ethics under the guise of a doctrine of virtue, in part 2 of the Metaphysics of Morals, 1797, Kant even has the previously established autonomy of ethical willing enhanced by what he calls the autocracy of ethical reason in the determination of the will. While the autonomy of reason consists in the giving of reason's moral law, modeled on the political power of legislation, the autocracy of reason resides in the habituated capability to enact the moral law of reason against the countervailing influence of the inclinations, modeled on the political function of execution, executive. For Kant, the ancient character disposition of excellence, arete, rationally reduces to virtue, Tugend, as the studiously cultivated propensity to act according to the moral law and because it is the moral law, rather than for other selfish reasons or even contrary to the moral law altogether. The difference between Plato's essentially ancient conception of the soul's rational rule over itself and Kant's decidedly modern notion of autonomously and autocratically rational willing notwithstanding, Plato's and Kant's accounts agree on an ethos of self-control and self-discipline that is to permeate a human life worthy of being called free. But for Kant, mere self-control, or even self-control by rational means, is not sufficient for ensuring ethically meaningful freedom. For there is, on Kant's view of the matter, the not uncommon case of the self's very own sensibility coercing its rationality into service, thus instrumentalizing reason, which amounts to a kind of self-coercion, Selbstzwang as Kant calls it, that is essentially unfree, unfrei, unfreier Selbstzwang. According to Kant, only a self-coercion that involves reason, and reason alone, constraining sensibility, independent of any sensory influence, can be considered a case of genuine, or as Kant calls it explicitly, free self-coercion, freier Selbstzwang. That's in the late Metaphysics of Morals. In Kant's, ethical self-coercion and free self-coercion coincide, and vice versa. By contrast, to Plato's essentially ancient sensibility, the very notion of self-control excludes a ruling role of the senses, desires, or appetites, given that human beings are by nature, their own nature, either such that they are to rule or are to be ruled, and are not subject to choosing and changing in that regard. To put the matter in terms of the relationship underlying all ancient Greek thinking about freedom and unfreedom, the sensory is the natural slave, Aristotle's term, to reason. Now, to modern sensibility, the explicit enslavement of the senses not only fails to recognize the genuine contribution of sensibility to the economy of the mind, as ascertained in academic manner by Baumgarten in his emancipation of aesthetics from logic. For some modern thinkers, such as Hume, the ancient outlook also errs in failing to recognize the essentially enslaved position of reason with regard to the passions, slave of the passions. To be sure, Kant does not share the sentimentalist and mythological assessment of reason's solely subservient role. On the contrary, on Kant's considered account, presented in the Critique of Practical Reason, reason is not only able to motivate willing, but to sufficiently motivate it all by itself, as disclosed in the famous, or rather infamous, fact of reason, to be understood as the immediately certain and practically efficient awareness of one's unconditional moral obligation. To be sure, previously Kant himself had considered reason to be able to provide at most the criterion for assessing the morality of willing and acting in what he called a principium dejudicationis, while regarding the force underlying the actual execution of moral willing and acting, principium executionis, to be a feeling, sui generis, a moral sense. By the 1780s, though, Kant came to entrust reason, more precisely practical, will-determining reason, with sufficient pull or push to generate an entire volition and the ensuing action, this constituting the rare, in fact the sole case of pure reason being practical all by itself. Pure practical reason, or as Kant sometimes calls it, practical pure reason. The sufficiently motivating potential of practical reason claimed by the critical Kant has seemed to many a cheap solution in the manner of a deus ex machina, a divine device miraculously dropped onto the theater of the modern mind, coming out of nowhere and providing a dramatic solution that may entertain but cannot satisfy. To Kant, though, the introduction of purely practical reason must have seemed the only option in a scenario that excluded the morality of feeling embraced by the British, chiefly Scottish moralists, and the perfectionist moral teleology of an ethics of essentially theoretical, merely cognitive reason, espoused by continental rationalists. Yet Kant seems to have overlooked the Platonic solution to the ethical ineffectiveness threatening mere reason, which consists in taking recourse to a force or source at once distinct from rational thought and from the irrational appetites or desires, one that can be made to aid reason in the latter's effort to subdue the irrational, much like a general employs an army to fight the enemy. But as far as ancient leanings go, Kant was neither a connoisseur nor a follower of Plato's aristocratically inclined moral psychology and ethics. To the extent that the ethical formalist rationalism permitted, or even required, Kant was a neo-Stoic, or rather a neo-Stoic, influenced by late Roman imperial age Latin language Stoicism, such as Seneca's, who teaches and practices the mastery of any and all passions, including such potent motivators of private and political action as anger, ira, in order to establish and maintain a serene mindset, tranquillitas animi. To Kant's Stoic sensibilities, Platonic thymos, with its linkage of virtue to virility, as also conveyed by the Latin virtus, would have appeared a most unreliable ally, prone to turn against reason and establish its own martial and manly regimen. It was left to one of Kant's closest successors to provide a variation on the Platonic theme of the soul's two-horse chariot, though informed not by an ancient image from warfare and competitive sports, but by a modern notion for the driving force behind the various phenomena of life and living beings. The term drive, Trieb, introduced by Carl Leonhard Reinhold into philosophical psychology, had a recent and short history in nascent biology, where it served to label the dispositions for the shaping of a living being with respect to the latter's parts, organs, and whole organism. Chief advocate of the discourse of the drive had been the Göttingen physician, physiologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who had sought to trace the origin and growth of living organisms to an underlying formative drive, Bildungstrieb, that was supposed to be less a newly discovered manifest feature of animal life than an explanatory hypothesis of their overall organization and vital dynamics. Already Kant had approvingly accepted Blumenbach's interpretive device of the formative drive in the philosophical biology that formed the core of part 2 of the critique of the power of judgment. But it was Karl Leonhard Reinhold who, in the second volume of his Letters on the Kantian Philosophy, 1792, imported the notion of drive from natural philosophy into moral philosophy, the latter widely conceived as including the mind as well as morals. Reinhold's letters, especially the second installment that shifts the focus from the first to the second critique, combine introductory and explanatory aims with attempts at revising, if not the substance, then at least the presentation form, Darstellung, of Kant's academically informed philosophy in the interest of greater popularity and wider acceptability. In Letters 2, Reinhold substitutes the Kantian dual disposition of the faculty of desire, Begehungsvermögen, which had divided the letter into a higher reason-ruled and a lower purely appetitive register, with a duality of drives, each identified through its relation to the self. While both drives, distinguished by Reinhold in lieu of the higher and lower forms of desire, refer to the self, whose drive they are, and whom they are to propel into action, or move to inaction, the two, essentially both self-serving drives, are differentiated as selfish, selbstisch, and unselfish, unselbstisch, respectively. On Reinhold's view, the self-regard that is definitional of a living being's outlook and outreach manifests itself in two forms: as selfish self-regard, narrowly focused on egoistic aims and ends, and as unselfish self-regard, generously geared toward a more encompassing conception of self, akin to the ancient Greek virtue of magnanimity. Faced with the two kinds of desire, reconfigured as two opposite drives, the Reinholdian agent, so suspended between opposite drives, is to choose which of them to satisfy, with the process of deciding among them constituting an exercise of free choice, freie Willkür. Kant was neither pleased nor convinced by Reinhold's alleged emendation, which he regarded as making things worse rather than better. In particular, Kant objects to the parity between the selfish and the unselfish drive with regard to a choice reduced from being guided by reason to being an exercise in arbitrary election. Moreover, Kant denied that the alleged faculty, capacity, or ability, Vermögen, to follow the selfish drive and thereby act against the moral law could be considered a positive potentiality at all, when in fact, according to Kant, it had to be regarded as the entirely negative inability, incapacity, or non-faculty to follow the moral law, Unvermögen. In the same vein, for Kant, the alleged freedom to let oneself be driven by the selfish drive constituted a failure of freedom and a lack of truly free, autonomous willing. Plato would have shared Kant's qualms when seeing his horse-drawn chariot replaced by a duo of opposed drives, and the rational charioteer seeking to gain and maintain control of the entire setup, exchanged for an arbitrarily choosing drive elector, as though the drives were genuinely alternative modes for the vehicle's motion. In particular, Plato would have objected to the very notion that the alternative between the selfish and the unselfish driving force was really open, and the choice between the two of them arbitrarily free and equal. From a Platonic viewpoint, essentially shared by Kant, Reinhold's free choice among equipolant drives confuses the noble freedom consisting in recognizing and following reason and the base freedom of doing what one pleases, no matter what the grounds and consequences of such pseudo-liberal license. While ostensibly moving away from Kant and Plato, farther yet than Reinhold, Fichte continues the discourse of drives introduced in the post-Kantian philosophy by retaining rather than disregarding the Kantian conception of positive, ethically requisite freedom. To begin with, Fichte replaces the Reinholdian dualism of the selfish and the unselfish drive with the distinction between the natural and the pure drive, which is meant to better capture Kant's distinction between the lower and the higher faculties of desire. In particular, Fichte conceives of the pure drive as the inherent striving for freedom for its own sake, which thus forms the ultimate as well as the highest goal of human endeavors. In the context of his post-Kantian transcendental philosophy, Wissenschaftslehre, Fichte understands freedom as independence from anything alien and other, in the interest of unalloyed, pure self-identity or I-hood. By contrast, the natural drive for Fichte involves the striving from material ends of all kinds, along with the means for achieving them. The particular ends and the suitable means are given by the nature of things, by the naturally given disposition of the individual human being in question, but also by the natural circumstances of life at hand. On Fichte's outlook, the two drives are not so much opposed to each other as that they represent the different sides of the human being, which is at once finite and infinite, sensible and intelligible, beastly and divine, on Kant's proto-existentialist theo-anthropology of striving subjectivity. Accordingly, the overall strategy of Fichte's reconceptualization of Kantian practical psychology is integrationist and reconciliatory, to the point of envisioning the fusing of the artificially abstracted pure drive and the equally abstract natural drive into the concrete, reconciled ethical drive. On Fichte's post-Kantian construal, the ethical drive is to take its ultimate end, an ultimately infinite end, from the pure drive, which aims at nothing but absolute independence, and its intermediary, entirely finite ends from the natural drive, which represents the demands of the limited, materially manifest aspects of human existence. For Fichte, the fusion of the material natural drive and the formal pure drive results in the serialization of human agency. In each moment, the human agent is to act in such a way that the limited end pursued under the circumstances is to contribute to an entire consistent series, the infinitely remote terminal point of which is absolute freedom. The details of Fichte's vision of the moral order, approached in so many different ways by multiple parallel series involving distinct individual agents, remains largely unclear, even unaddressed. Fichte seems to assume a pre-established harmony of sorts between the parallel series in their joint effort to establish complete independence at the price of utter identity between naturally diverse agents. For Fichte, the ethics of absolute freedom culminates in the prediction more than in the prescription that ultimately every ethical being will act the same, because all ethical beings are the same. To be sure, Fichte's post-individualist scenario of absolute ethical identity remains an infinitely removed end, ever to be approached and never to be achieved. But it reflects a political-philosophical mindset that equates total freedom with total identity, identity with oneself as well as with all others, at the expense of difference and diversity at the individual and social levels. Fichte's ethics of the mixed drive has substituted Kant's ethical criterion of the universality of the moral law with the pseudo-ethical, deeply political requirement of a comportment common to all. Kantian proto-liberalism has been switched to Fichtean proto-socialism. In a related development, Fichte's ethics skews recourse to the rationality-geared device of the categorical imperative, instead basing moral assessment of self and others on the alleged unerring voice of conscience, Gewissen. With the procedural rationality requirement removed from Fichte's ethics, the orienting as well as the motivating force of action resides entirely in the drives, in the overall orientation provided by the pure drive, and in the impetus to particular, serially suited actions promoted by the natural drive. All that is left to the driver, Plato's former charioteer in charge, is to carefully coordinate the short-term and the long-term drive, which, first by themselves and then jointly, propel the chariot with little need for steering or guiding on the part of the driver, who is more of a passenger than a charioteer in Fichte's now identity-fixated psychomobile. The freedom that comes with Fichte's post-Kantian retake on the chariot of the soul is at once major and minor. It consists materially in the sought-after, but actually unattainable absolute freedom of utter independence and complete self-identity, and formally in the freedom from necessitation through any given drive that has not been found to fit into the overall serial scenario of ethical progress. With the Kantian law replaced by the postulate of sheer self-identity, and Kantian pure practical reason replaced by the voice of conscience, Kantian autonomous and autocratous freedom, initiative freedom according to a self-given law, also receives a radical replacement in Fichte. It reduces to the somewhat ceremonial function of consenting or dissenting to what the composite character of the mind, of the mixed drive, pushes for. Based on Kant's derogatory remark about the freedom of a wound-up mechanical turnspit fired an his Bratenwenders in the second critique, one could call this Fichtean formal freedom the freedom of the rubber stamp. Looking back across Fichte and Reinhold to Plato, it seems that the ancient function of the charioteer has become obsolete. The modern soul appears largely moved by drives of various kinds, with little else to do for the remaining driver on the chariot than to react to competing, conflicting, and coalescing drives. It is entirely in line with this takeover of the chariot by the horses, when Freud declares, barely a century after Reinhold and Fichte, that the rationally free self, the I, is not the master in its own house. Kant would have agreed with this sober assessment, given the realist, not to say pessimist, anthropology that forms the reverse of his idealist ethics of rationally free autonomy. The sublime thought of reason being practical all by itself, and hence sufficient to determine the will, seems to have become a tall tale, not unlike Plato's uplifting myth about the charioteer of the soul. Thank you.